What is truth? We've given an answer to this question, Alfred Tarski's answer. In the case of a simple toy language for the sentences of which we define truth, and we managed to define it in familiar terms. In order to do so, it was necessary to determine the vocabulary and the grammar of that language in precise terms. In other words, the language needed to be a formal language. At first we stated recursive definitions for sentencehood and truth for that language, but then we turned these recursive definitions into more standard explicit definitions. For that purpose, we employed talk about sets. With these definitions in place, we were able to prove general claims about truth, claims about infinitely many sentences, by a similar method as the one that mathematicians use when they prove statements about natural numbers. We presented the liar paradox and explained why the definition of truth for our toy language does not fall prey to it. And we saw that by building a whole hierarchy of languages on top of our toy language, we would also be able to define reflective truth and to derive truths about sentences of the toy language. Mathematical methods have been crucial to all of that. Let me conclude by addressing a couple of potential worries. First of all, our toy language is but a toy language. What one can say in that language is enormously restricted. Why should we be interested in it at all? The answer is, ultimately, we are not interested in that silly toy language. But it is a good starting point. Methodologically, the situation is not different from the one in science. Say, we want to study some phenomenon, in our case, truth. At first, one studies the target phenomenon in a highly restrictive setting, in which it is easy to keep certain parameters fixed and under control. In our case, that's the toy language setting. Once one understands the phenomenon there, one starts to relax parameters. That's when we turn to more complex languages. And that is exactly what Tarski and other philosophers did. For instance, in principle, it is possible to state a Tarskian definition of truth for the language of modern physics. That's not so trivial anymore. Or for some big chunks of natural language, maybe after some cleaning up, that is, some formalization of that part of natural language. And sometimes linguists have already formalized the relevant parts of natural language in their own work, and we can simply build upon their formalizations when we want to define truth. Secondly, you might have the nagging feeling that not much has happened really. We wanted an answer to the question, what is truth? And all we got was trivial truth equivalences and a definition of truth for sentences with certain expressions that showed up again on the right-hand side of that very definition. If that is on your mind, then you should go back to the beginning of this lecture and ask yourself, what kind of answer did I expect to our initial question? Reconsider, what is grandfatherhood? Well, define it in familiar terms. What is truth? Well, define it in familiar terms. That's what we did. If that's not good enough, why? Thirdly, I should add that Tarski's work from the 1930s and 1940s is of course not the end of the story. For instance, some philosophers after Tarski thought that one should not aim to define truth explicitly at all. Obviously, all definitions must come to an end somewhere. Some terms at least must be taken to be primitive, undefined. And since the term true seems so fundamental, why not take it to be such a primitive term? Of course, that in itself is not yet good enough. We still need to determine the meaning of true somehow. But to some extent, that can be done without stating a definition. For example, the membership predicate in set theory, something being a member of something, is not defined in set theory in terms of anything else. But rather, one states axioms, postulates, in which the membership predicate figures. These axioms at least constrain the meaning of the membership predicate to some extent. Accordingly, one might constrain the meaning of true by some axioms in which that term figures. For example, Why not take some of the truth equivalences as the axioms of truth? And philosophers have worked this out in detail. A different criticism of Tarski's theory concerns the branching of the concept of truth into many such concepts, which we observed at the end of this lecture, when we investigated how we would be able to define truth of, truths of, and so on. Each meta, meta, and so on language did have its own level or type of truth predicate. Wouldn't it be possible to have something like a Tarskian theory of truth, of truths of, and so on, but where there is just one truth predicate that does the job on all the levels? Famously, the US-American philosopher Saul Kripke suggested a way of doing better than Tarski along these lines in a paper from 1975. And since that time, various other theories of truth have been developed and defended along similar lines. But they all build on Tarski, and they all use mathematical methods. Some of these theories also suggest a more radical way out of the liar paradox than the one that Tarski had proposed. The idea is to accept both P1 and P2, but to change the rules of logic so that the conclusion might well follow from P1 and P2. But it is not contradictory anymore in a bad sense. In a logic different from the standard, so-called classical one, maybe a sentence of the form A if and only if not A is not actually problematic. That's what's so cool about philosophy. You're even allowed to question the underlying logic of your reasoning. But in many of these approaches, one also softens the blow somehow. For example, things might be set up so that one may still reason classically with normal everyday sentences and sentences in mathematics and the sciences. And the logic gets changed only really when one reasons with paradoxical sentences, such as the liar sentence. A fourth point. What if your understanding of the term true differs crucially from what I had presupposed in this lecture? Then clearly having Tarski's definition of truth available won't be of big help for you. Why think that Tarski has any right to say that his notion of truth is the right one? Why do I have the right to say so? Well, in principle, obviously, I'm perfectly happy with discussing other accounts of truth. Make them sufficiently clear to me so that I can understand them, and then let's talk about it. But I wonder how different your understanding of truth will be. For instance, do you accept the truth equivalences for everyday sentences like snow is white is true if and only if snow is white? And do you understand if and only if as it is understood in standard classical logic? And thus, for example, also in present-day mathematics and so on. If so, then your view is at least in the same ballpark as Tarski's. The difference can't be that big. Now say, you're fine with classical logic, maybe, but you do not buy the truth equivalences. Your understanding of true does not support the truth equivalences. Then I would still suggest that you should develop your view in all proper detail. I would only wonder if you should call it an account of truth. Why not use a different term than true for the concept that you're interested in? If only to avoid possible misunderstandings with people who use the term true in a way that does support the truth equivalences. And there is great potential of misunderstanding here, for many people do accept the truth equivalences. They may find them trivially right, but even more firmly, they must accept them. Which leads me to the final worry. We ended up with a definition of truth that is not much harder to get than a definition of, say, multiplication. Well, not very much harder anyway. Where is the deepness of the original question gone? What is truth? It's like when the magic of the infinite seemed to have disappeared at the end of the first lecture. But neither is actually the case. Remember Cantor's theory of infinities. There are sets of ever greater sizes of infinity. I mentioned at the end of the first lecture that all sets whatsoever taken together are too many to form a set. In other words, there is no universal set. Accordingly, consider a universal language, a language in which one can express everything that is meaningful at all. We found today that it is not possible to state a formally correct, and materially adequate definition of truth for such a universal language. For such a definition would have to be carried out in some language again. Hence, that definition of truth could be formulated in some way in the universal language itself, which would lead to the contradictory conclusion of the liar paradox. So there is no universal language for which one could state a satisfactory definition of truth in the sense of Tarski. If a natural language such as English is universal, then we cannot state a satisfactory definition of truth for it as a whole, only for fragments of it. And yet we are comfortable speaking that language. Isn't that magical enough?